apparently. I didn't know we had one of those, but we do. Pass them around. Chili cook-off is February 28th. In March, traditionally we have pie days. Everybody brings a pie. Sometimes it's a savory pie, sometimes it's a sweet pie, but we usually do that at a trailside tap room. Play board games, do stuff there. I'm looking for somebody from the party planning committee to tell me whether it's at trailside tap room again, but it usually is. We've got time.
Should be.
We've got Palm Sunday. We're putting together some plans for an outdoor service. It'll be great. Good Friday. We're having a Passover Seder. We used to do that in the past. We're bringing it back. So I'm very excited about that. So all these things, put on your calendar. Be aware that they're going on. We'd love if you came on down to hang out. Important for people who are extra prepared, the last Sunday of every year, we have the weekend Refuge camping trip. We'd also love if you were around. Come on back, college students, hang out with us. We'd love to see everybody. So, those are the things we have going on. Hang on to that, put it on your fridge. Don't forget, we'd love to hang out beyond church service. Where are we? What are we doing? Where have we been? We're in this series called What About? It's specifically geared for those of us who have gone through deconstruction. Maybe we're doing our reconstruction, and or maybe we've just grown up in the church and we've always had these questions and never felt like there was space to ask them and get some answers and work it out in discussion and community. And so we've been talking over these different topics. Go ahead, Chris. So we talked about the history of all these different atonement theories. Some of us grew up with only penal substitutionary atonement being the kind of story about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection that was allowed, that was said, this is the only gospel. And if you abandon it, you've abandoned God. We talked about how that's never been the case across the story of the church. We spent 2 weeks talking about big classic narratives in the Old Testament that can be particularly upsetting for people. What about the flood? What about the conquest? We took time to talk over those things, how they might be a little bit different than we might have grown up hearing about them. This week, we're talking about the queer community specifically. So for some of us, the question of how do I still identify as a Christian, as a Jesus follower, attend a church, when the story of either my people, my community, or the people that I love has always been exclusion, has always been oppression and suffering. How can I lend my identity and my name to that and be part of that if that's the story of the queer community in the church? So we're going to talk about that story today. We're going to talk about the history of queer Christianity, the queer church. And this is not specifically a sermon on the argument for being an affirming church, which we are, and dealing with all the clobber verses, as they are called, of the different texts that people use to make arguments against the LGBTQIA community. That's not what this is. This is instead, is it true that throughout the whole history of the church there's only been oppression, there's only been suffering, or have there been people and spaces all along which have affirmed and made room, carved out space for people who are LGBTQIA+, who also love God, love Jesus, and see salvation in Him for their present and their future as their only hope in life and death. So we are going to get cracking into it. I'm excited. Trust that you're excited. We got other stuff coming up around the corner. You can see it there. But for now, we're going to start with the biblical era. We're going to trot through this whole thing. So biblical era, if you're not familiar, again, on the YouTube, it's the most watched video on the Refuge YouTube. Wonder why? I take a lot more time to walk through different verses like this, but if you're wondering, like, where are queer people in the biblical era, specifically the New Testament era, these are the places to start. So Matthew 8, Luke 7, Jesus heals a pais. Pais is this Greek term that even people who are not affirming of LGBTQIA inclusion in the church, they affirm that a pais is a name for a companion, a sexual companion of men in the Roman army. So the story that we're probably familiar with of the centurion coming to Jesus and saying, hey, I have this servant who needs to be healed. That word is a pais. And we know that it's referring to this relationship. And critically when Jesus engages with the centurion. Although in plenty of other passages in the Gospels, when he heals people, he says, go and sin no more. He doesn't tell the centurion that. He just says, your faith is greater than any that I've encountered in all of Israel. Your faith has made him well. And that's all he says. No, and also now repent and get your life on track, right? That doesn't show up. That's in there. You can go read it. Acts 8, one of our first converts to Christianity, is what in sociology, psychology, sexuality studies we call third gender, right? A eunuch is a third gender. And again, Stephen runs into this eunuch on the road, and the eunuch is baptized and brought into faith in Jesus. And at no point does Stephen say, now, let's make sure we clean up your life and figure out which part of the gender binary you're in and make sure you're sleeping with the right people. That conversation does not happen. The Pauline context, in which so many of those verses that we've grown up hearing about being against the LGBTQIA community, specifically the context is so important, which of course we're always talking about at Refuge, but the context is very anti-marriage. So for those of us who are brought up in purity culture, we're like, the only way of being that is right is to be married in a heterosexual relationship. That is completely divorced from the biblical world. The biblical world, the context of marriage is, number one, women should, their property, they need to adopt the gods of the household that they marry into. They should be staying home and sewing, right? If you think about Penelope and the Odyssey specifically, that's what she's doing. She's a good woman, she's at home, she's weaving. Interminably, which some of us love weaving, so power to you, but that's not all of us. So that was what women were supposed to be doing, and having relations with your wife was something that was seen as pretty gauche. Like, you should only do that to produce an heir, because of the way that they thought about sexuality at that time. It was really thought for men only really appropriate for them to have relationships with slaves and with minors or men. And so the context throughout the Bible for these verses that have now been translated differently, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes, is talking about this pagan context where if you want to get up in society and you want to have a mentor, it's expected if you are a young boy to enter into a sexual relationship with an older man. That's how you get into society, get into the door, is this specific kind of mentorship relationship. So that's the context in which we're talking about pederasty, as we see there. It's what Paul is talking about. And again, even non-affirming theologians now admit that this is true when you read their commentaries and theologies, which is a big step forward. We're excited about that. So that's the player. Moving forward into the early Christian era, they're still concerned about the pagan context. So if you read early church fathers and mothers and you see them saying things that are not affirming, I might say, we're still in the middle of this pagan context. That's still what's going on. However, that doesn't mean that people who were in same-sex unions were not still enjoying the fullness of relationship with God and one another. And so we've got some names here that you could Google and read more about. Depicted here are Sergius and Bacchus, a very HBO heated rivalry branded. They were both bodyguards to Caesar, and they were in love, and they were Christians, and when they were persecuted, it was for being Christian, not for being in a same-sex union. Nearchus and Polyeuctus also, one of them converted to Christianity in order to be in intimate relationship with the other one, and then when they were again persecuted for their Christianity, not for their love, it was they appeared to each other in dreams and said things like, we're going to be together forever for eternity, don't forsake your vows. All of this is written down. Cosmos and Damian are Arabic. Early Christian same-sex union, they were surgeons, and there's accounts of them being helpful to their community, both in traditional medical practices of that time and also supernatural healing, which is fun. So these folks pop out throughout the accounts. There's not that there were absolutely no gay Christians until, I don't know, 2010. That is not true. They've been here the whole time. Going on to our next era here, we've got the Middle Ages and the medieval era. Before, we were really worried about the pagan culture that we talked about for good reason. Now we're worried about corruption via pleasure. So like, oh, we can't have things that are too nice, right? You've seen the movies. You might be familiar with this kind of posture that they had in the medieval era. You can't be just a little distract from what's. However, at this particular time, we have the birth of a church-sanctioned ceremony to bring together a same-sex union. You might notice a lot of these, by the way, are men. That's because history is always concerned about what the men are doing. So sorry to women. Even when women were caught up to something, they received like 7 days of penance. In contrast to the men who got like 160 days of penance, because nobody really cares what we get up to, for better or for worse. So we have this adelphopoesis. It's not my language of choice. It technically means to wed as brothers, which is the euphemism that's been around for ages. If you read the Song of Solomon, you'll see them saying like, "Oh, I wish you were my brother," and we're like, "Oh." They meant in terms of intimacy and closeness and always being together and having a shared mission in the world. That's what brother meant. So what is brothers? What did this involve? It was done by the church. It was a religious ceremony. There were prayers. There was a priest involved. There were vows. They exchanged, instead of rings, they exchanged crosses that they kept with each other. We know that it wasn't celibate, though sometimes you'll run into people who want to paint it that way, because we have primary sources of bishops complaining about this and saying, "Hey, I know that they're all sleeping together. This is upsetting me." So again, the story is not that there's never been homophobia in the church and the whole time everybody was just partying and rainbows were everywhere, but rather that there's always been people who loved God and loved one another in same-sex partnerships. So there's plenty of these to choose from, but I happened to pick the Sheriff of Nottingham, that one, from Womanhood. He apparently was in one of these relationships with a fellow named John Clanbow, and they went to the Crusades together, and they died in the Crusades, and that's their tomb there, two helms kissing. So super straight. So make sure that that's their tomb. Very sweet, and now it kind of recolors those relevant stories. Right, we can go back. Another really important thing that happened in this era is the development of monasticism or monasteries. Monasteries were always spaces for people who were queer, people who were avoiding forced marriage, right? Your parents say, "No, you have to marry him," or "No, you have to marry her," and you don't want to, and so you go and you dedicate your life to being in a lovely stone building with a whole lot of people who are the same sex as you. Interesting. And so we have all of these other stories. This, again, was not super covert that nobody knew about. We had abbots writing to one another. I've talked about this before, but one of my favorite letters, the abbot is saying, "We have such a dashing young monk just joined, and everyone's so distracted. What should I do?" And the other abbot says, "Leave him on his own for a while. Make sure he grows a beard. It'll be so much less hot that way, and everyone will be able to carry on appropriately." This is also the case in nunneries. And again, it's not that this is like way down on the DL. This is just a part of life. There's arrangements where the nuns could share rooms, which we know included shared beds. And again, nobody really cared because they were women. Story of the centuries. But that's a great transition to our next era, colonial and imperial era. Here, instead of being so worried about pleasure, which is, again, the theological drive in the past era, now we're really worried about the Reformation. So the reformers show up. Luther, right? We know the story probably. In the early 1500s, Luther looks at the Roman Catholic Church and says, corruption everywhere. And he was right. There's financial corruption. There's indulgences. They're a form of corruption, right? And he's also pointing out these Italians, they're gambling. They're having all sorts of sex. They're getting up to no good. The church is completely lost. The church has fallen. Even the Pope, it seems that some of them were, Pope Leo X specifically, you can look up. Trying to counter Reformation, the church says, oh my gosh, Luther has some points. Let's curtail some of this corruption. Let's get on the straight and narrow so these Protestants don't have as much ammo to fling at us, right? And so in the 1530s, they enact this anti-LGBTQ, anti-same-sex union legal stance. What happens after they do that is the known psychopath, Henry VIII, really wants to get a divorce from his wife, famously. We know this. And he, the very next year, he's trying to curry favor with the Pope because the Pope keeps delaying, giving him his annulment for complicated reasons. And so he tries to curry favor by putting it into the English common law that he also is banning same-sex unions and penalizing getting caught in those relationships. So Italy, England, Scandinavia, huge with the Lutherans, right? So we get anti-LGBT laws up there. Russia has always had a crush on Europe, wanted to be seen as part of Europe, and so they enact the same things. And then all of the specifically English colonies are planted by English people, and they also institute English common law. And so that's why in early America, we have all of these more strict, scary, oppressive laws. However, that was not the case the whole way around the globe. So Prussia, Germany, the Netherlands, France, Andorra, Luxembourg, Belgium, and all their colonies, right? France and Belgium specifically, and the Netherlands have colonies all over Africa, the Caribbean, anywhere in the global south, right? They have no problem with same-sex unions. They think everybody's freaking out for no reason. They decriminalize specifically. So in some places, there has been decriminalized LGBTQIA church, by the way, still part of the state here. Church-sanctioned situation since the 1700s often is when those kicked in. And also, you're probably familiar with the media, everybody being astounded at the French and what they're always up to down there. And Benjamin Franklin, and he's probably where most of us are familiar with that. But again, LGBTQIA people continue to live, continue to love God, continue to flourish. So this is Benedetta. She's a Catholic nun. She, if you know anything about Catholic nuns, they're like the original charismatics. If the original charismatics weren't prophets in the Bible era. She is in a lesbian relationship and writes all about it, and also has visions of Jesus. And what she gets in trouble for is being a woman who's having all these visions, not particularly her same-sex union. Going forward in time, Gerard Manley Hopkins, he's a Jesuit priest and a poet up there with T.S. Eliot. He was in that kind of group. He was well known to have a partner. His name was Digby. I find delightful. We should bring that name back. Again, this was not super on the DL. This is not hidden hugely under the carpet that no one can know, and we only know from letters. It was well known that these things were carrying on, that these people were devout Christians, Jesuit priests, and also part of the LGBTQIA community. Frederick Faber is also an Anglican theologian. Some of the traditional conservative hymns some of us might have grown up singing, written by an openly gay man. And we just kind of pretend that that never happened. How did we get there? If this used to be the case, that there were people who were open about their relationships and also open about their faith in Jesus, how do we get to the kind of church situation we have today? Well, let's look at it. Specifically, we're going to talk about 20th century America because that's where we are, except for a century ahead. So, our concern now is not with the Reformation. It's not with pleasing the Pope so we can get a divorce. It's with communism. This might be surprising, but if we dial back to the beginning of the 20th century, we've got the Bolshevik revolution, probably seen Anastasia, right? We've got this violent communist overthrow of the Tsarist Empire, and in America also we have violent communist engagement with the government. So if you didn't know, there's a bunch of bombings of Wall Street done by specifically Russian Jewish communists in the early 1900s, and that set up the whole century to be very concerned about communism. And kind of perhaps bizarrely, we are not familiar with it. At that time, communists were like synonymous with homosexuality, because they're the libertines and they're people who weren't conforming to the structured order of things, and so this kind of libertinism went with them everywhere. So much so that J. Edgar Hoover, who also was openly gay, because he was anti-communist, nobody minded, because everybody knew he was tracking the communists down and taking them out. So we have these Red Scares where all the communists were fired, people were losing their jobs. Those went at the same time with the Lavender Scares, where everyone who was gay also lost their job. We had helping this at this particular time was there was this ex-communist who got saved by Billy Graham, who also was gay and then became like the first big ex-gay celebrity. And so in evangelicals' mind, communism and homosexuality start to go together. However, you'll notice that is still a socio-political motivation throughout all these times. Worried about the Reformation, worried about pagan culture, worried about corruption through pleasure. None of those things are driven by biblical exegesis. And now we start to get into the era where we can start to make that argument, because by standard Bible, which the NRSV is still used across, especially mainline denominations in America. So if you grew up Methodist or Presbyterian or Baptist, etc., most people use this Bible. It was funded by the FBI. The FBI gave them money to change these verses that had been truer to the Greek, that say things like pederasty, or say things that were not clearly about LGBTQIA relationships. The FBI gives them money to insert the word homosexuality into the Bible for the first time, because the word homosexuality was only invented in the late 1800s and the 1880s by psychiatrists. So it was a new concept. We didn't even have that concept before. And then it gets wedged into the Bible by the FBI because they're worried, again, about communism. So then we have evangelicals start writing their commentaries and their Bible dictionaries, and they have this word for the first time, and they're not familiar with it because it hasn't shown up before. And so they start hiring psychiatrists to come and write their theologies, which again is not biblically based. Alfred Kinsey of the Kinsey, whole huge part of our understanding of the psychology of sexuality. In his books, he writes that so many of the gay Christians that he meets have no idea their church's position on sexuality. So again, up through this time, the church is not known to have a specific position until the 1970s, when we start having these new translations following the FBI meddling, and then we have the moral panic and James Dobson and all those people responding to the sexual revolution of the 60s. So until the 70s, we didn't even have this biblical exegesis. So the story we hear over and over through the community that is anti-gay in Christianity says, like, we're just saying what we've always said. We're being faithful and true to the Bible. You guys are being shaped by culture. We're just saying that the Bible is said for thousands of years. That's not true. The Bible hasn't even said that for thousands of years. It's only said it since 1946. And we've only started to do anti-gay Bible interpretation since that time. So all of that is actually the new thing, not an affirming theology, not a theology that makes room for people in all of their diversity. So what are our takeaways? Our takeaways are that there have always been queer people who have put your faith in Christ. If you are a queer person today and you identify as a Christian, you are part of a long history and beautiful legacy of people who, even in difficulty, have still found safe places to be and to love one another. That is not me. She's just going to be a preacher. She's safe for queer folks. So we talked about monasteries, we talked about Alda Foyes, however that's said. These places, these ways of being together have been part of the church. Again, they're not a new invention that's shaped by culture. They have been around for all of this time, and we are grateful that we get to be a place that continues, that legacy continues that history. And then finally, the anti-gay American church is a new innovation with political, not religious roots. Again, taking the Bible and saying, well, this and this and this and this and this way. That is a new thing that's happened because of the FBI and because of a reaction to the sexual revolution, all those things. And so I've put a large bank of resources if you want to read more, if you've never heard anything about this, you are a nerd, probably why you're at this church. Congratulations. You can find those in the Slack, and then when it gets loaded as a video on the YouTube, it'll also be in the YouTube description. So you can check my work, you can read more, you can learn more. We love that. But we are moving into a time of communion together this morning. And it's special to me that it lines up this way, because so often at Refuge, when I'm talking about communion, I'm talking about the Eucharist, we're inviting ourselves to that table. We're talking about at the end of time, we'll all be part of God's household at God's table, eating and drinking, celebrating who Jesus is together. And often the invitation is to say, remember that there are people who are different than you there. Remember that your enemies will be there. Remember that people who voted differently than you will be there. And with that spirit, enter into this very, very old ancient ritual. But today, the invitation might be a little bit different if you find yourself in the LGBTQIA community, or even if you're an ally, rather than imagining people who are different than you being at the table, maybe for the first time. Imagine that there are people who look like you to be found at that table, that there are people with your same identity, with your same life experience of challenge and difficulty and joy and love to be found at the table of the Lord in the last days and also in this time. So I'm going to pray our traditional prayer and read our traditional words, and then John's going to play some music for us. We're an open table, so if you are somebody who wants to celebrate the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, you're welcome to. You don't have to be a member. We don't even have membership here. Nobody will notice or pay attention if you do go or you don't go. That is up to you and in your hands. But I will read this and then I will pray. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after dinner, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." God, I thank you that there have always been people who are diverse in your family. That Christianity, people who love you, follow after you, are pursued by you. We have never looked just one way. We've never just been a bunch of white Europeans doing the same thing. We've always had a diversity of beliefs, diversity of ideas, a diversity of loves, diversity of unions. And we've always been welcomed by you, and I thank you for the faithfulness of allies over the years, people who have had power and people who have not had power, who were faithful to you and who you are, and making room for everyone to come and be able to freely experience you. So we thank you for that. We thank you that we bear that responsibility and that honor at Refuge Church, and I pray that we would continue to steward that responsibility with joy and integrity. And I thank you that you do not discount people who you made differently, that you welcome all of us together to eat of your table, experience you, have a relationship with you, encounter you. So I pray that you would be time in this ancient ritual, that you would meet us maybe in a new way, we would be able to experience you through new eyes. And as we partake and as we sing this song. pray all of this in your name, Jesus. Amen.